So we come to that coveted time of the day, the last talk. I stand between you and drinks and snacks at the Botanical Gardens. I thank all of you for sticking around. Fortunately, I only have 40 slides, so we'll get through this in no time. No, stop. Correction, I have 12 slides. We will get through this fairly quickly. This work is part of my research, as mentioned, at the George Washington University. I represent Convolution Solutions, where we're developing next-generation software update solutions. This work is done in cooperation with my advisors, Dr. Thomas Mizuki and Shahram Sarkani. And this talk is fairly high level. There is a more detailed technical representation of this work that's coming out in IEEE Spectrum. So if you ping me on the conference app, I can give you a heads up as to when that's coming out if you really want to know more details on what we're doing. So I'm going to start very high level and say, you know, it shocks me that there's this, what I call a contradiction or conundrum in software update. This has been a debate in particularly the OT world for many years. I'm not going to resolve it here, but just point out some of the facts, right? In the IT world, you'd be considered negligent or incompetent if you're not running the latest software, if you're not trying to, you know, get up to the latest version. Because updates are critical, right? You need it's a best practice. They block new attacks. They support defense in depth. It's a good thing. You want to be protected against the latest and greatest attacks. But of course, software updates are also a threat, right? I mean, what's a better thing for an attacker than, hey, here's a way to shove new code into this device and it'll just run it and it'll do whatever you ask. So enabling software updates dramatically increases your attack surface. It's a very attractive target for attackers. It can have unintended consequences, particularly in OT, where you have relatively low-powered devices. You might be running on the limits of your controller, its capabilities. You install a software update, as we all know, you want to test it first, make sure you didn't break something that you didn't intend to, or cause some unintended consequences. You may have fixed a software hack, but created a control system instability that you didn't know about. So you need to test and validate your code before you deploy it. Also, it's been pointed out many times that software updates can highlight vulnerabilities, right? You're advertising to the world like, hey, there was something broken in this code, I just fixed it. So we know that attackers will look at binary diffs before and after the update. They're going to use that to figure out what was the thing that you fixed and use that to say, well, I know everybody's not applying the updates, and now I know where to go attack in all the other systems. And there's tools and techniques to mitigate that, but I'm not going to get too deep into that. Really, I'm going to focus on the supply chain, moving the code from the vendor to the device, and also accounting for that testing that you need to do and making sure that that's all part of a coherent, logical system. We know that failures happen. I'm not going to go into all the details here, but I'm sure you're familiar with Stuxnet. That was very simplistic from a supply chain perspective, right? USB sticks left around, attractive nuisance. They got plugged in, devices got updated with malicious code. The ASUS Shadowhammer attack, a little more aggressive. This is one where attackers actually took control of a software distribution hub, had credentials so that they could post their own fake code, and it got distributed to millions of ASUS devices. SolarWinds, aggressive attack, devastating effect. Because devices were aggressively downloading, installing the latest update, now there, the attackers didn't actually get into the update mechanism, right? They were more upstream. They were part of the development release cycle, so they were actually feeding into, you know, bad code into the release process. But still, because the updates were there, they were applied, the attacks got massively distributed. And then the Kaseya VSA attack is one where a software installation tool that was used by a lot of MSPs was compromised, so attackers were able to inject their own malicious code and get it automatically distributed to a lot of systems. So these are just a few examples. There are many more. There's a lot of attacks against like repositories. Like if you run a Linux system and it's grabbing new code from repositories, there's a long list and long history of attacks against those repositories. So let's look at the contradiction here again and say, you know, we've got two devices, very similar functions, but totally different update methods and different requirements, right? So a Nest thermostat measures temperature, controls something. And in your house, I think we're all better off if that device does automated software updates, right? It pulls down the latest code, probably checks the signature on it. If it looks good, it'll install the code. Better off for everybody. There might be risks, yes, somebody could get into the supply chain, but you're net better off because of all the potential risks. You as an operator in your home probably don't have a lot of defense in depth. You're probably not monitoring the network very carefully. Whereas a thermostat or temperature controller in an industrial process, you might want to think differently about that. This is where you probably want to test the code. You probably want to get the code from the vendor, make sure it came from a secure source, make sure it was expected, make sure that it works on a test device or some test configuration, and then you deploy it on your thousands of Omega controllers in your network. So you would handle these very differently, even though functionally these are almost identical devices, just different environments, different worlds. And as we know, critical infrastructure networks are complex by design. That makes these update processes even more complicated. So you've got these multi-layer networks, again, lots of defense and depth. And so getting the updates to the target device is hard. Doing validation is a little hard too, right? So best practice typically is you put a digital signature on the code. That's considered to be sort of like almost the gold standard, I'd hate to say. So the problem is, if you have a digital signature on the code, can a device way down in your network, can it check a certificate revocation list to see if there was a problem and you had to revoke that? Can it get time updates to see, like, is this the code that was expected at this point in time, or is this an old update that you shouldn't be getting? So there's a lot of edge cases that the edge device can't really do on its own because it can't see the outside world. It's limited in what it can observe based on the network architecture. And again, you have devices with fairly limited functionality, so you might be pushing the limits of what they can do just to do the cryptography, to do a digital signature on your code to begin with. So even getting to that standard is hard. And yet, even when you do that, when you do have digital signatures, there still can be problems. Touched on this already, that in a critical infrastructure network, you want to trust but verify. You don't want to just take the latest code and just deploy it on all of your devices. The best practice is that you get the code from a trusted source, you check the integrity of it, you make sure it was expected, but then you're also going to run internal tests. You're going to run it on a nearly identically configured internal system. You're going to make sure it doesn't break anything, right? And this might actually require multiple tests. If you have the same controller that's doing different things in your plant, you probably want to test it under each of those different conditions. This is expensive. This is complex. This requires extra hardware, extra time. So you've got to really plan ahead and have that extra equipment available and invest the time and effort to do that. So again, just applying a digital signature to the code is good. That can prove on that phase 1 part of the update, that can give you assurance that the code you got is valid code and legit, but you still have to do the hard work of checking that the code is valid before you deploy it to your many relying systems. Again, can you trust the update? So when code arrives, when you get new code from your vendor, is this valid code? Obviously, I mentioned a couple times, you want to make sure it came from a trusted source, right? Is this from the vendor that you expected it to come from, or did it come from some other back channel like the USB sticks with Stuxnet? I mentioned already best practice, probably put a digital signature on it. Sadly, a lot of update mechanisms just stop there. They just say, oh, we use PKI, we use digital signatures, we're smart, isn't this cool, this is best practice. The problem is, in a realistic environment, you can't trust a key forever. Like, you can't just put a public key in a device, burn it in, and assume that the corresponding private key will never be compromised, or the system will never become unavailable, or that you'll never have to change that key, it'll never expire, you'll never have to change your cryptography. You got to account for all these future events. If this system's going to be in use for the next 10, 15 years, you need to account for the fact that that key needs to change. You need a way to update it. You need a way to revoke it. You need a way to tell the device that, hey, don't trust any updates anymore, and just stop, because you're better off that way. So a digital signature with a public key infrastructure, or PKI, is a much better architecture. As I've already mentioned, that can be challenging with a critical infrastructure environment, because getting the PKI updates, the certificate revocation list, and new commands, new root information into the device can be challenging. But if you can mitigate those issues, it's a much better structure, and it gives you control over the network. Reminder, don't confuse source integrity with code integrity or content integrity. So a lot of vendors will say, hey, we use HTTPS, everything's cool. Like, the device talks to us, it's an HTTPS connection, it knows it's getting the code from us, so everything's good. That's not good, right? That often gets compromised. There's a variety of ways to inject code into that channel. So don't trust just a secure connection. Make sure that the device is actually checking the binary, the content of the code, checking a digital signature on it. Not all signatures are created equal, right? So it is now time to worry about post-quantum cryptography. I'm sure you've heard a lot about it. You know that NIST has started to create a list of algorithms. So just going to the traditional ECC or RSA and standard key lengths, not good enough anymore. You need to account for the fact that very soon you're going to need to change algorithms, you're going to need to change key sizes. You need to start addressing that now and understanding how you're going to make that transition, how you're going to support crypto agility. Do you ask your vendors about crypto agility? Make sure they have a plan. Make sure they have some way of dealing with this. And that might just be like shut off the update mechanism altogether in some future state. If I can't support better cryptography, then you're better off to not do updates anymore. Just stick with what you got. Or have a way to update the algorithm. Even if you don't know what it is yet, maybe you can move it in through a root management process. Do look at the properties of mature PKI. So again, don't trust that just because somebody uses digital signatures that it's always the best practice. If somebody claims to have a public key infrastructure, ask some questions. Say, do you have a certificate policy and a certificate practices statement? A best practice, a good operator will have that. They'll have a clear definition of what they sign and why, how they operate. They might require an NDA to share that CPS with you, but they should have it, and you should be able to review it and see what they have. Make sure they do have a documented process for revoking certificates, recognizing when things have gone bad and stopping the bleeding. So revoking those validation certificates that are out there. And that they have a documented root and ICA rollover policy. So again, certificates and keys don't last forever. They eventually have to expire. So there needs to be a point in time in the future, probably while your device is still in the field, when you're going to have that root expire. You're going to need to replace it with a new one. How do you do that? How do you get the new public keys out to your devices? Ask those questions. Touched on threats against software updates. Even if you have digital signatures, there's still a lot of attacks that you should be aware of and thinking about. I'm not going to go into all of these in detail. I'll touch on a few. Obviously, the biggest one you're most worried about is arbitrary software installation. If you do no digital signatures, no checks, then your device will just accept code and run it, and you can run anything you want. Obviously, you need layers of protection on top of that, so you need an operator or somebody to check source integrity to make sure that what they're installing is real. I'll mention some of the more interesting ones, like a rollback attack is one where if an attacker knows that there's an older version of the software that was vulnerable to some cool attack, they might try to deploy that older code to your system. And what's kind of nice about it is if they have a digitally signed version of it, your device might accept it. Like if it's just checking a digital signature and it doesn't care about things like version numbers or anything, or incremental counters or dates on the software, it'll just check the code, say, oh, it's got a good digital signature, and install it. So we've seen cases where you can legitimately roll backwards, introduce a vulnerability that used to be in the system, and then take advantage of it. Also mentioned the freeze attack is kind of a fun one. So you often worry about, like, we got to get the updates installed as fast as possible. A freeze attack is one where the attacker knows that you've got a vulnerability in your system, they want to exploit it, they need a little more time to take advantage of that vulnerability, so they're going to try to do anything they can to make sure you don't get the next update. They might compromise the file but it gets delivered to you so it doesn't validate. They might send junk files to you so you don't know which one's right. They'll do whatever they can to make sure that you don't install the latest update, just to give them a little more time to take advantage of that attack that they know your system is vulnerable to, and they know that this next update is going to correct. If you go through the paper, there's more detail on some of these others. I'll just mention one other one, extraneous dependencies. So often an update mechanism, we see this particularly in repositories. So if you're pulling code down from a library, it might reference to say, oh, to make this work, you also need the latest version of this other library or this other version of something else. So you can point to a dependency, and that dependency might be compromised. Or the attacker may have injected their flaw into that dependency, right? So if you let your code just grab other stuff dynamically because it says, oh, to run this, you need this, then it's another risk, right? So you want to make sure that your updates are fully packaged and atomic, that you're not grabbing extra stuff off the internet. Now, if you think about sort of what's the best solution, I've already hinted a few times, just doing a digital signature is probably not good enough, right? You need to account for the PKI and key management and all of that. So if you go to the other extreme, like how can you architect a system that is protecting against all the attack types that I just showed in the previous slide? Well, A team has done that. They've created a framework that's commonly known as the update framework, or Tough. Tough is typically talked about in, again, the IT world. It's more of a system you would use if you're running a Linux repository or if you're running a Docker containers and you're trying to distribute them. They have an implementation of Tough that they use to protect the updates that they distribute out to their community. And the basic idea behind Tough is to use a lot of digital signatures, not just one. Use a lot of signatures and a lot of keys. I'm not going to go through this all in detail, just a couple of highlights. So you've got some root keys that are shared with your system at manufacturing, but you can update them. So you can send a message that says, look, the old root's signed to this. Here's a new root that you should install and expire the old ones. So you have a way to do root rollover and root management in the system. It's kind of built in. Every new software update gets digitally signed as part of a manifest. So your targets.txt file is a signed manifest that says, here's the hash of all the code that you should be installing. And it's fully inclusive. This is all the code you should install. There's no extra dependencies that you need. Release.txt is sort of a note to say the most recent version of the code that's available is this release, and don't trust anybody who says it's anything else. And that's also digitally signed by a different key. And then there's also a timestamp.txt. So timestamp is something that you should get periodically. You should expect to see this timestamp file digitally signed. It shows up at your doorstep on a regular basis. If you miss one, you know something's wrong. You know somebody's trying to block something. You may not be able to recover. You may not be able to do anything about it, but at least you know you're being attacked. So the timestamp is another digitally signed file. It tells you which the current release is. And again, you should always expect to see that signed file show up on a regular basis. Very robust framework, hard to deploy, hard to maintain, and again, designed specifically for the IT world, right? It doesn't really translate well to the OT world. So one of the challenges is how can you extend this? How do you adapt this to an OT environment? So one thought is you want to apply all those checks, all the signature checks on Tough really at phase one of your critical infrastructure. So if you have a supplier who can or does support Tough, then you're going to want to make sure that you have an agent that receives new updates from that vendor, and you're going to run all those checks. You're going to check that this is the current release. This is the one that has the right timestamp on it. You've got all the sequence of timestamps. You're not missing any. Nobody's trying to block you. So you have an agent that says, yeah, everything's good. This is the update that you expected. This is good software. So this would be like a software agent, runs on the perimeter of your system, has two-way access to the outside world. Just gives you information. It tells you that the update that you received is legit. It came from the right vendor, and this is the right update to review. So it gives you all that confidence. But now how do you get that update to your end system, and how do you enforce the checks, the validation that you want to do? So what we've proposed is adding another layer to Tough, which we call the deployer role. So in the Tough framework that I showed you before, you've got targets and release and timestamp and root. You got all these signed files. Well, we're going to add another signed file to it. And why not add more signatures and more keys? So we add deploy.txt. And the idea here is that on premises, you're going to run your validation tests. You're going to test your code. You're going to make sure that it works correctly in the target environment. If it works correctly, then you're going to create this deploy.txt. It's going to reference the version number, the hash, basically, of the targets file, the manifest that tells you which code you should be running. And you're going to put a signature on it that says, hey, I've actually checked this code and it's valid. We'd go a step further and say you probably don't want to put just one signature on there. You probably want two. You want to avoid collusion where you can have operators who, if one rogue operator says, yeah, that's the code I want to install, you want to avoid that. So having at least two signatures is kind of a best practice. So the deployer.txt is a local signed file that you can use to inform the target system that this is the code that you actually want to be running. There are a couple of other manifest-based update frameworks like Tough. If you look in the industry, you'll see Uptane. Uptane is a version of Tough for the automotive industry. They've made some similar adaptations. They've simplified Tough a little bit, made it easy to deploy code to vehicles. Suit and UpKit are really for IoT devices, so they extend Tough, make it easy to deploy to lots of numbers of devices. We think this is the first time that Tough has really been adapted for an OT environment. So we look forward to getting feedback on the architecture and look forward to deployments with this code. So in the end, updates, are they good or evil? Obviously, I think that the result is out. It is a net good. Being able to update code is important. Being able to protect against the most egregious, most current attacks is important. But you have to be cautious. Don't abdicate responsibility to vendors. Make sure that you're actually validating code and doing the testing that you have to do. Do select suppliers that support strong, validated updates and supply chain integrity. Do invest that time and effort in doing the testing, and do plan for that managed deployment, meaning that you put those signatures on the code or you validate your code so that your end devices know that they can trust that not only it came from a trusted vendor, but that you did all of your work along the way, and nobody tried to slip something into the workflow. I thank you all for sticking around. I really appreciate it. Why don't you go grab some drinks and some snacks. Thank you.
Thank you so much.